January 17, 1943. Somewhere in the forested hills west of Rabaul, New Guinea, the air is thick with moisture and the scent of rotting vegetation. Insects hum in waves, rising and falling like breath. Inside a corrugated iron shed, one of dozens hastily erected after the American retreat, a young Japanese naval technician named Warrant Officer Takeshi Yamada kneels before a workbench. His hands, steady despite the heat, cradle something that should not exist in this place. A captured American SCR-268 radar set, its metal casing still bearing scorch marks from the firefight that brought it here. The shed offers no relief from the equatorial sun. Sweat drips from Yamada's nose onto the foreign machine. He does not wipe it away. His attention is total, reverential almost, as if he is in the presence of a sacred text written in an alphabet he cannot yet read. Around him, 3 other technicians work in silence, their movements careful, deliberate. They have been ordered to understand this machine, to decode its mysteries, to replicate it so that Japan might see in the dark as America does. It is January, and the war is still young enough for such hopes to seem possible. Outside, the jungle continues its eternal routine. Growth and decay, predator and prey, a cycle older than nations. But inside this shed, time has stopped. The men do not know it yet, but they are about to embark on a journey that will reveal not just the limits of their technology, but the vast and terrible distance between 2 industrial worlds. The radar sits before them like a mirror, and what it will reflect is not merely American ingenuity, but the full weight of an economic and manufacturing gulf so profound that no amount of courage or determination can bridge it. This is not a story about failure. It is a story about realization. To understand the moment Yamada's hands first touched the SCR-268, one must understand the nature of the war Japan had chosen to fight. In December 1941, when carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor and Japanese forces swept southward into Southeast Asia with a speed that stunned the world, the Imperial Japanese military seemed unstoppable. A modern force wielding tactics and equipment that had been honed through years of brutal conflict in China. The Zero fighter dominated the skies. Japanese torpedoes proved devastatingly effective. Naval doctrine, shaped by decades of preparation for a decisive battle, appeared flawless in execution. But this appearance of modernity was selective, carefully curated. Japan had entered the 20th century as a feudal society, and had, through sheer force of will and strategic borrowing, transformed itself into an industrial power within 2 generations. Yet this transformation was incomplete, uneven. Japanese industry excelled in certain areas. Optical instruments, for instance, were world-class, and Japanese torpedoes were arguably the best in the world. But in other domains, particularly those requiring mass production of complex electronic components or precision machining at scale, Japan lagged years behind. Radar was one such domain. The principles of radio detection had been understood by Japanese scientists since the 1930s. Research teams at the Naval Technical Research Institute and the Army's technical headquarters had produced experimental systems. By 1941, Japan possessed rudimentary radar sets, crude, heavy, unreliable, but functional enough to detect aircraft at modest ranges. These systems were deployed sparingly, treated almost as experimental curiosities rather than essential tools of war. Japanese military doctrine had not yet fully integrated radar into its operational thinking. Night combat relied on superior training and optical equipment. Anti-aircraft fire depended on visual acquisition and the skill of gun crews. The idea that invisible waves could pierce darkness and weather to reveal enemy positions was intellectually accepted but not viscerally believed. Then came the first encounters with American radar reports filtered back from Guadalcanal, from the Coral Sea, from midnight engagements where American ships seemed to fire with impossible accuracy through pitch darkness. Japanese pilots spoke of American fighters appearing out of clouds with uncanny precision, as if guided by unseen hands. At first, these reports were dismissed or attributed to luck, to superior numbers, to the fog of war. But as the encounters multiplied, a pattern emerged. The Americans were not guessing. They were seeing. The capture of intact American radar equipment became a priority. In the chaos of early Pacific battles where front lines shifted rapidly and bases changed hands overnight, opportunities arose. The SCR-268 that Yamada now examined had been seized during a hasty American evacuation. It was a ground-based searchlight control radar, designed to direct anti-aircraft fire. Not the most sophisticated system in the American arsenal, but far more advanced than anything Japan had fielded. To Yamada and his team, it represented a window into American technological thinking, a chance to peer inside the machine and extract its secrets. What they expected to find was a puzzle, certainly, but a solvable one. Japanese engineers had reverse-engineered foreign technology before. The early development of Japanese aircraft had relied heavily on studying German and American designs. Machine tools had been copied from British and American models. The assumption was straightforward. If the Americans could build it, the Japanese could understand it, replicate it, perhaps even improve upon it. After all, were not Japanese craftsmen legendary for their precision? Had not Japanese industry already produced some of the world's finest optical instruments? The first cuts into the radar's casing were made with confidence. What Yamada found inside the SCR-268 was not a puzzle but a revelation of absence. The radar's interior was a landscape of components that seemed at first glance familiar. There were vacuum tubes, resistors, capacitors, transformers, the standard vocabulary of radio electronics. But as Yamada and his team began to catalog and measure each element, disquiet set in. The vacuum tubes were unlike any they had seen. Compact, uniform, manufactured to tolerances that seemed almost impossibly tight. The glass envelopes were flawless. The internal elements were perfectly aligned. When they tested samples carefully because each tube was precious, the performance was consistent across units. Not approximately consistent. Identical Japanese vacuum tubes, by contrast, were handcrafted affairs. Each one slightly different, requiring individual testing and selection for critical applications. Variability was accepted as inevitable, a consequence of manufacturing realities. Radio operators learned to coax optimal performance from their equipment, adjusting and compensating for the quirks of individual components. This was not seen as a flaw but as a testament to skill. The ability to work with imperfect tools was a mark of expertise. But the American radar did not expect expertise from its operators. It expected only that they follow procedures. The machine's reliability was built in, designed into every component. This was mass production of a kind Japan had never achieved in electronics, not merely making many units, but making many identical units, each one meeting specifications so precise that they could be installed interchangeably without adjustment. The resistors told a similar story. American resistors were color-coded, their values marked with standardized bands that could be read at a glance. Japanese resistors required measurement, their values often inscribed by hand or recorded in documentation. The American system assumed a supply chain so vast and so organized that thousands of technicians across hundreds of bases would need to identify and replace components quickly, without confusion. It assumed abundance, that parts would be available, that broken units would be repaired or replaced rather than nursed along. Then there were the capacitors. The dielectric materials used in the American components were unfamiliar. Analysis suggested advanced polymers, materials that Japanese chemistry had not yet developed for mass production, the metallurgy of the connectors, the quality of the solder, the design of the circuit boards. Every element spoke of an industrial infrastructure operating at a level of sophistication and scale that Japan could not match. Yamada sat back from the workbench one evening, as the jungle darkened and the night creatures began their chorus, and felt a cold certainty settle over him. The problem was not that the radar was too complex to understand. The problem was that understanding it made no difference. Japan did not possess the tools to make the components. The gap was not one of knowledge but of industrial depth, layer upon layer of manufacturing capability, each depending on the one below, all the way down to foundational elements like steel quality, chemical purity, and machine tool precision. He thought of the workshops back home, where skilled craftsmen coaxed miracles from limited materials. He thought of the improvisation that characterized so much of Japanese manufacturing, the clever workarounds, the substitutions, the reliance on individual skill to compensate for material shortcomings. These were virtues born of necessity, and they had served Japan well in many contexts. But they could not produce 1,000 identical radar sets. They could not create the industrial ecosystem that the American radar represented, an ecosystem where standardization, Interchangeability and mass production were not afterthoughts but foundational principles. The symbolism was inescapable. The radar was not just a machine. It was a mirror reflecting two different philosophies of industrial organization. Japan had built its military might through centralization, through elite corps of highly trained specialists, through equipment that required skill to operate and maintain. America had built its military might through decentralization, through systems designed for average operators, through equipment that could be produced in such quantities that loss was acceptable, even expected. One evening, Yamada held an American vacuum tube up to the fading light. It was a small thing, barely longer than his thumb, yet it contained within it the signature of a vast industrial apparatus. He thought about the factory where it had been made, imagined assembly lines, rows of machines, workers performing repetitive tasks with mechanical precision. He thought about the raw materials, glass from one facility, tungsten from another, specialized chemicals from a third, all flowing together in a logistics network that spanned a continent. He thought about the engineers who had designed not just the tube but the machinery to make the tube, and the machinery to make that machinery. Japan could not build this, not in 1943, perhaps not for years. The report Yamada would eventually submit to his superiors was precise, thorough, and devastating. It detailed not just the technical specifications of the SCR-268, but the industrial requirements that would be necessary to replicate it. The tone was professional, clinical even, but between the lines lay an unmistakable conclusion. Reverse engineering American radar was not a matter of acquiring knowledge. It was a matter of rebuilding Japan's entire industrial base from the ground up. The attempt did not end with Yamada's report. The Imperial Japanese Navy, desperate for any advantage as the war's momentum shifted, authorized a crash program to develop improved radar. Factories were repurposed. Resources were allocated. Teams of engineers worked around the clock. But each step forward revealed new obstacles. Vacuum tubes could be produced but not in sufficient quantity or with adequate consistency. Advanced components could be hand-built for prototype units, but scaling up production proved impossible. Supply chains, already strained by the demands of conventional weapons production, could not support the additional burden of electronics manufacturing at the required scale. By mid-1944, Japanese radar technology had improved, certainly. New models were deployed, offering better range and reliability than the early experimental systems. But the gap with American technology had not closed, it had widened. American radar was everywhere, on ships, on aircraft, in portable ground units. It guided fighters to their targets, warned of incoming raids, directed anti-aircraft fire with lethal precision. The night, once an equalizer where Japanese optical superiority and training could compensate for material disadvantages, had become an American domain. Japanese soldiers and sailors experienced this shift viscerally. Veterans of early campaigns recalled night battles fought at close range, decided by discipline and skill. Now American forces engaged from distances where Japanese optics were useless, where training meant nothing, where the only thing that mattered was whether one could see through the darkness, and the Americans could. The psychological impact was profound. It was not merely defeat, but a specific kind of defeat, one where courage and determination offered no answer, where the enemy possessed tools that rendered traditional virtues irrelevant. There is a record, fragmentary and unconfirmed, of a conversation that allegedly took place in late 1944 between Yamada and a junior officer recently returned from the Philippines. The officer described a night engagement where his unit had been systematically destroyed by American artillery firing from positions they could not see. The shells had arrived with metronomic regularity, each one precisely targeted, as if the Americans were reading coordinates from a map rather than firing blind into darkness. The officer's voice, according to the account, carried not anger but bewilderment. "How do they see us?" he asked. Yamada's response is unrecorded, but one can imagine the weight of his silence. The radar had taught him that the question was not how the Americans saw, but why they could see. The answer lay not in any single invention, but in a civilization that had organized itself around principles of standardization, mass production, and abundance. American radar was effective not because American engineers were smarter. Japanese scientists understood the principles perfectly well, but because American factories could produce components by the millions, because American logistics could distribute them across a global theater, because American doctrine assumed that equipment would be available in such quantities that losing units to enemy action was acceptable. This was the ideological gap, even more than the technological one. Japan had entered the war with a philosophy shaped by scarcity. Every resource precious, every piece of equipment to be maintained and preserved, every loss a tragedy. America fought with a philosophy shaped by abundance. Equipment was expendable, losses were statistical problems to be solved with more production, and the answer to any challenge was to apply more resources. The radar was a physical manifestation of this philosophy. It was designed to be reliable enough for any soldier to use, simple enough to be produced by the millions, standardized enough to be repaired with parts from any supply depot. Japan had no counter to this. No amount of fighting spirit or tactical brilliance could compensate for an enemy that could outproduce and outsupply at ratios of 10 to 1, 20 to 1, higher. The industrial contest had been decided before the first shot was fired, but it had taken the war itself and small revelations like Yamada's encounter with the SCR-268 to make that reality undeniable. There is a specific sound that Yamada would later recall from those months in Rabaul, the hum of American bombers passing overhead at night, not the roar of engines that came later during the actual raids, but the distant, almost subliminal hum that preceded the attack by minutes or sometimes hours. It was the sound of formations assembling, of aircraft guided into position by radio and radar, of a logistics system so vast and confident that it could announce its intentions hours in advance and still proceed without fear. Japanese forces had no equivalent. Japanese bombers flew individually or in small groups, relying on navigation skills and weather windows. Coordination was limited. The idea of assembling 100 aircraft in darkness, guiding them to a precise point and having them arrive in formation was operationally impossible. Not because Japanese pilots lacked skill, they did not, but because the supporting infrastructure did not exist. The radar, the radio navigation aids, the ground control systems that made such operations routine for Americans were absent or primitive in Japanese service. This sound, the hum of inevitable approach, became a symbol for Yamada. It represented not just tactical superiority, but a fundamental difference in how the two nations conceived of war. The Americans fought with a confidence born of material abundance. They could afford to telegraph their punches because they knew the defender could do nothing to stop them. The hum was a kind of psychological warfare in itself, a nightly reminder that the Americans possessed capabilities that rendered traditional defenses obsolete. Some nights, lying in his bunk as the hum grew louder and the anti-aircraft guns began their futile barking, Yamada would think about the vacuum tube he had examined months earlier. That tiny component, mass-produced by the thousands, was more than just a piece of electronics. It was a message. It said, "We have so much that we can afford to put this in every radar set, every radio, every piece of equipment. We have organized our entire society to produce these things. You cannot match this, not with courage, not with ingenuity, not with anything you possess." The bombers came, and Rabaul burned and the hum continued. Night after night, a mechanical lullaby of industrial supremacy. By early 1945, the strategic situation had deteriorated to the point where reverse engineering American radar was no longer relevant. Japan's industrial cities were being systematically destroyed by firebombing. Supply lines had collapsed. Factories that might have produced advanced electronics were rubble or ash. The question was no longer how to match American technology, but how to survive the next month, the next week. Yamada's fate is not recorded in available archives. The shed in Rabaul was likely destroyed in one of the countless raids that reduced the base to a backwater. The SCR-268 he had studied with such care was probably buried under jungle growth or salvaged for scrap by Australian forces after the war. But the knowledge he had gained, the understanding of the gulf between Japanese and American industrial capability that had spread through the technical branches of the military like a slow, cold poison, it was not defeatism exactly. Japanese forces continued to fight with ferocious determination until the very end. But among the engineers and technicians who understood what the captured American equipment represented, there was a quiet recognition that the war had been unwinnable from the start. Not because of any failing of courage or strategy, but because the industrial foundations upon which modern warfare rested were so unevenly distributed between the combatants that the outcome was essentially predetermined. This is a hard truth, one that does not fit comfortably into narratives of heroism or sacrifice. It suggests that the millions of deaths, the years of suffering, the destruction of cities and lives were all in service of a contest whose result was foreordained by decisions made decades earlier. Decisions about how to organize economies, how to structure industries, how to balance craft production against mass production. The radar was a teacher. It taught that war in the industrial age was not primarily about tactics or bravery, but about factories and supply chains. It taught that technology was not isolated inventions but entire ecosystems of manufacturing capability. It taught that abundance, the sheer overwhelming availability of resources and equipment, could compensate for almost any tactical disadvantage. These were lessons that Japan would absorb completely in the post-war era. The economic miracle of the 1950s and 1960s, the rise of Japanese electronics and automotive industries, the transformation of Japan into an export powerhouse, all of this was, in some sense, a response to the lessons of 1943. Japan learned to master mass production, to achieve quality at scale, to build the industrial depth that it had lacked during the war. The student became the teacher, producing consumer electronics and automobiles that Americans bought by the millions, exported on principles of standardization and reliability that mirrored those of the SCR-268 radar. But in 1945, that future was unimaginable. There was only the present, defeat, occupation, the weight of millions dead, and the bitter knowledge that the war had been lost, not on the battlefield but in the factories, in the decisions made decades before the first shot was fired. In the archives of Japan's National Institute for Defense Studies, there exists a technical report dated March 1943, authored by Warrant Officer Takeshi Yamada and several colleagues. It is a dense document, filled with circuit diagrams, component specifications, and manufacturing analyses. The language is precise, technical, devoid of emotion, but in the concluding section, there is a single paragraph that stands out for its starkness. It notes that successful replication of American radar technology would require not merely improvements to existing Japanese manufacturing processes, but a fundamental restructuring of industrial priorities. It would require imported machine tools, new chemical facilities, a massive expansion of electrical engineering education, and a logistics system capable of coordinating production across multiple specialized factories. The timeline for such a transformation, the report estimates conservatively, would be measured in years, perhaps a decade or more. The resource requirements would compete with all other military production. The conclusion, unstated but inescapable, was that Japan could not fight the war it was already fighting and simultaneously rebuild its industrial base to match American standards. This was the impossible choice that the radar revealed. To compete with American technology, Japan would need to divert resources from the immediate fight. But the immediate fight was already consuming everything Japan had. There was no slack in the system, no reserve of capacity that could be redirected toward long-term industrial development. The war effort was totalizing, all-consuming, and yet insufficient. More was always needed: more aircraft, more ships, more ammunition, more fuel. There was nothing left over for the kind of patient, systematic industrial construction that matching American radar would require. So Japanese forces continued to fight with the equipment they had, knowing it was inadequate, knowing the Americans could see in the dark while they remained blind. Tactics were adapted. Training emphasized night infiltration, close combat, anything that might negate American technological advantages. But these were stopgaps, desperate measures that bought time but could not change the fundamental imbalance. The radar sat in its shed, disassembled, its components carefully labeled and stored, a monument to a gap that could not be bridged. It had come from a world of abundance into a world of scarcity, and the collision between these worlds was the real story of the Pacific War, far more than any single battle or campaign. It was a collision of industrial philosophies, and one side had entered the fight already equipped with tools the other could not hope to forge in time. There is a post-war interview, conducted in the 1970s, with an engineer who had worked on radar development during the war. His name is not Yamada, but he had read Yamada's report, had worked with some of the same captured American equipment. The interviewer asks about the moment he realized Japan could not match American technology. The engineer is silent for a long time. Then he says something that gets at the heart of the matter. It was not one moment, he says. It was a process. Each time we solved one problem, we discovered two more behind it. The problems went down and down like roots of a tree. We kept digging, thinking we would reach the bottom, but there was no bottom. Eventually, we understood that the tree was not the radar itself, but America's entire industrial system. To copy the radar, we would have to copy America. And that was impossible. To copy America. The phrase is telling. What the engineer recognized, what Yamada had recognized in that shed in Rabaul, was that technology is not separable from the society that produces it. The SCR-268 radar was an American artifact, not just because it was designed by American engineers, but because it embodied American approaches to manufacturing, American assumptions about resource availability, American doctrines of standardization and interchangeability. To replicate it, Japan would have needed to adopt these approaches wholesale, to become, in some fundamental sense, more like America. This was not merely a technical challenge, but an ideological one. Japanese society in the early 20th century valued craft, individual mastery, the particular over the universal. These values had deep roots in Japanese culture and had shaped industrial development accordingly. Mass production existed, certainly, but it was oriented toward relatively simple goods. Complex equipment, especially electronics, remained largely the domain of skilled specialists who built and maintained each unit individually. American mass production represented a different philosophy, the universal over the particular, the system over the individual, abundance through standardization. It was a philosophy born of specific historical circumstances, a vast continent with abundant resources, a society built by immigration and therefore lacking deep craft traditions, an economy that had industrialized rapidly and without the constraints of older feudal structures. This philosophy was encoded in every component of the radar, in the very concept of producing thousands of identical units designed for use by minimally trained operators. To copy the radar was to copy the philosophy, and to copy the philosophy would be to transform Japanese society in ways that went far beyond military technology. This, ultimately, was the lesson that the radar taught. It revealed that industrial war was not just about weapons but about entire civilizations, how they organized labor, allocated resources, structured education, conceived of human potential. The Americans had organized their civilization around abundance, and in doing so had created an industrial system capable of overwhelming any opponent through sheer material superiority. Japan had organized its civilization around scarcity and craft, and had created an industrial system capable of producing excellent individual artifacts, but unable to compete in a contest of mass production. Neither philosophy was inherently superior in all contexts. But in the context of total war in the mid-20th century, the American approach was decisively more effective. The radar was evidence of this, incontrovertible and humbling. 60 years after Yamada knelt before the SCR-268, Japan had become a global electronics powerhouse. Japanese radar systems were among the world's best. Japanese semiconductors dominated global markets. The industrial depth that had been absent in 1943 had been painstakingly constructed, layer by layer, over decades of focused development. The student had learned the lesson completely, but the cost of that learning, the years of war, the firebombed cities, the millions of dead, could never be recovered. The radar had been a teacher, but the tuition had been paid in blood and ash. There is a photograph taken sometime in late 1943 showing a group of Japanese technicians posed around a workbench. The image is poor quality, badly faded, but one can make out the shape of radar equipment in the foreground. The men's faces are serious, focused, showing no hint of the knowledge that would soon burden them. They look like any group of engineers examining an interesting problem, confident in their ability to find a solution. What the photograph does not show is the moment that would come later, when confidence gave way to realization, when the problem revealed itself to be not a puzzle, but a mirror. What it does not show is the weight of understanding that certain gaps cannot be bridged by cleverness or determination alone, that some wars are lost before they begin, that the true battlefield of industrial conflict is not where armies meet, but where factories operate, where supply chains function, where millions of identical components flow from assembly lines. The photograph freezes a moment before that knowledge took hold. It is a picture of hope about to be disappointed, of questions about to reveal uncomfortable answers. Yamada's hands, in that frozen moment, are reaching toward the radar. He does not yet know that what he is reaching for is not a machine but a mirror, and that what the mirror will show him is the vast distance between two industrial worlds, a distance measured not in miles, but in manufacturing capacity, in resource abundance, in civilizational choices made long before the war began. The reach continues. The mirror waits, and the lesson, patient and inevitable, prepares to teach. In the end, the story of the Japanese attempt to copy American radar is not a story about radar at all. It is a story about the nature of industrial power in the modern age, about the deep structures that determine which nations can sustain total war and which cannot. The radar was merely the vehicle through which this truth was revealed, a small, dense package of American industrial capability, delivered inadvertently into Japanese hands, where it proceeded to demonstrate through its very existence the impossibility of the Japanese position. Every component told the same story. Every measurement revealed the same gap. The vacuum tube said, "We have factories that produce these by the thousands with tolerances you cannot match." The capacitors said, "We have chemical industries you do not possess." The circuit design said, "We have engineering teams large enough to standardize every element to make systems so reliable that any soldier can operate them." The whole assembly said, "We have organized our entire civilization to produce war material at a scale you cannot imagine, much less replicate." This was the final brutal lesson, that modern warfare is decided not by courage or tactics, or even by technology in isolation, but by industrial ecosystems so vast and complex that they take decades to build and cannot be improvised in the heat of conflict. Japan had entered the war with excellent ships, outstanding aircraft, and superb torpedoes, but it had entered with an industrial base inadequate to the kind of war it was fighting. The radar made this visible in a way that no amount of abstract analysis could match. Yamada saw this. Others saw it. The knowledge spread quietly through the technical branches of the military, a bitter pill swallowed without complaint. The war continued because stopping was not an option, because the decision to fight had been made and could not be unmade. But among those who understood what the American equipment represented, there was a quiet certainty that the end was already written, that the rest was merely the working out of an equation whose terms had been set before the conflict began. The hum of American bombers continued through the night. The radar that had taught so much sat disassembled in its shed, a prophet of a defeat that was still in early 1943, years away but already inevitable. And somewhere in the darkness, Japanese soldiers prepared for battles they would fight with courage and determination, not knowing that the real war, the war of factories and supply chains and industrial depth, had already been decided against them. The lesson was complete. The price would be paid in full, and the mirror, patient and implacable, continued to reflect truths that no one wanted to see but that everyone, eventually, would be forced to acknowledge. This is the story of a radar set and the men who tried to understand it. But it is also the story of two civilizations, two philosophies of industrial organization, meeting in combat and discovering that the contest had been decided long before they met. It is a story about tools and the tools needed to make tools, about abundance and scarcity, about the deep structures that shape history in ways far more profound than any single battle or campaign. In January 1943, Warrant Officer Takeshi Yamada knelt before an American radar and began a journey of understanding that would lead him to recognize the ultimate futility of the war Japan was fighting. His hands, careful and skilled, took apart the machine piece by piece, and with each piece the truth emerged, that Japan lacked not just the tools to copy American radar, but the tools to make the tools and the tools to make those tools, down through layers of industrial capability that America possessed and Japan did not. The radar taught, the students learned, and the lesson, written in vacuum tubes and capacitors and precision manufacturing, was simple and devastating. Some wars are lost not on the battlefield but in the factories. Not in the clash of armies, but in the organization of industrial systems, built decades before the first shot is fired. The hum fades. The jungle reclaims the shed. The radar, its lesson delivered, disappears into history. But the truth it revealed remains cold and permanent as steel. That abundance, in the end, is its own kind of weapon, perhaps the most decisive weapon of all.